I went into teaching, it's sort of a big story, but I got my degree. I was a very good student, but not a very happy one. You know, I had to work through college, and I didn't have time to sit on the lawn to talk about philosophy. I just went from class to class. So I really worked pretty hard. And while I was in college, we did a big series on people, places, politics, and I was one of the producers. So that was for a CBS station in San Francisco. So I was one of the student producers, and I produced it, and I loved it, you know. And they liked what I was doing. So when I had my BA done, they hired me as a floor manager. And I got my MA. I went into the MA program at Stanford while I was already working, you know. So it was pretty difficult to do both of it, but I did all right. And then I discovered that it's really a routine thing in both. You know, it was a routine thing in school, it was a routine thing in the industry. So I thought, well, maybe I can improve it a little bit, you know. So I did all sorts of improvements in television, which sometimes were, they were appreciated and sometimes not so much appreciated, you know. So, but anyway, I liked what I was doing very much. And I learned a great deal. In those days, we did a lot of remote, all live, everything was live. And finally, I became a producer director. You know, we directed hundreds of commercials, live commercials, and they all had to work. You know. Like pouring Pabst Blue Ribbon fights, the boxing fights, we had to pour beer live on camera and had to have the right head. It was very complicated. And the writers all came from film. And we couldn't do any post-production, so. But anyway, I liked it very much. So I was in the industry, and I liked the industry, and I never thought of teaching. So finally, a friend of mine who got his PhD at Stanford when I was getting my MA, he was an announcer for that particular station occasionally. And he came, and his name was Stuart Hyde, and he came to me and he said, "Herb, how about teaching?" I said, "No way, you must be kidding, you know, teaching." I mean, for me, that was just impossible. In the meantime, my former department chair at Stanford had an opening, and he said, "Herb, you want to come to Stanford?" And I said, "No way, I don't want to teach, you know, I have my profession, I like it." They said, "Why don't you come and have lunch?" You know. So I went down and had lunch, and it was all nice, you know, and at that time, Wilbur Schramm was hired too, and everybody talked about statistics and standard deviations, and it was big, you know. Quantitative research was big. And I just shook my head and I thought, you must be kidding. I mean, you're not real, you people, you know. Here I am, you know, putting out show after show, and you guys talked about standard deviations. So it was a very nice interview, and they wrote me a letter and said they liked me and they wanted me. And they offered me a very low salary. So I said, you guys must be kidding. I can't do that on that salary. So he wrote me back and said, I got a raise now for you. I have $400 more than what I offered you. And so I turned him down. I didn't want to go there. Besides that, that wasn't my atmosphere. The Stanford University atmosphere wasn't my cup of tea. So in the meantime, I found out that they paid Mr. Schramm 5 times as much as me. So it was a star system, and I wasn't a star. You know. So I said goodbye. So I went back and did my thing and liked it. And I just had directed a big dance show, a 2-hour spectacular, rear screens, airplanes landing, Hawaiian dancers, singers, you know, the whole thing. And it went flawlessly. So everybody said, "Herb, good job," and I went, "Great," you know, "Oh, good job." Even my TD, who never liked anybody and anything, said, "It was pretty good." So I turned around, there was Stu Hyde in the back in the control room. I said, "Stu, what are you doing here? How did you like it?" And he said, "Well, it was okay." I said, "But didn't you like the show?" He said, "Oh, it was okay." And then he looked at me and said, "Herb, is that all you can do with your talent?" So he really shook me up. And he again said, "Would you like to come?" He had just become the department chair at San Francisco State. And he said, "We have new ideas. we need new people, and wouldn't you like to come? So I came, and I said, where are your studios? Where's your equipment? He said, that's your challenge. And I took it. And then he wrote me a long list saying, you got to take a big cut in salary, which was true. You got to work harder, which I didn't believe, but which was true after all. He said, and he clicked off, you got to go get your PhD, which was true. And he clicked off all the negative things. And at the end he said, but at the bottom line is you will be working with young, creative people all your life. And that did it. And he was right. I couldn't have chosen a better profession. Probably to tell people how to do something responsibly and efficiently. That's probably the best contribution I can make. And I did it through different things, through different approaches. Some, I wanted to tell them how to use the tools. And that came about because when I started teaching, I said, where's the textbook? And they said, what textbook? I said, there was only one, Rudy Brett's. And he was the CBS guy, the special effects guy at CBS. And it was much too complicated. Nobody had a crane in those days, you know, and even if I had had a crane, but I wouldn't have known what to do with it. So I really, and so I went to my department chair, Stuart Hyde, and I said, well, how do I teach? What do you do? He said, well, write a book, write one. So I said, okay. So I wrote an outline of all I knew. And a friend of mine knew a brand new publishing company, Wadsworth Publishing Company. And I said, well, what is that? So he said, well, why don't you take the outline to them? And I put on my suit, my tie, and I went there. It was in the worst neighborhood in San Francisco on the waterfront, and a little narrow staircase. And I went up there, and there were all these young kids running around in shorts. And I thought, no. And it's all Goodwill furniture. And I thought, what? I said, am I in the right place? Is that the publishing company? Yes, yes, come on in. We're the Wadsworth Publishing Company. So I had the idea is it had to be black leather chairs and leather-bound books and all that. They were all just a bunch of young, very creative people who produced books instead of television shows. So they looked at it and they said, it sounds interesting, you know. What is television? Do we teach television? They said. I said, yes, we do. We don't have very many students. So one young lady came to me, and she happened to be the English teacher of my wife's in Berkeley, when my wife went to Berkeley. And she said, oh, Herb, isn't that you? I said, yes, me. She said, well, let me see what you got. So she said, well, we're going to send it out. And the art director came and said, how do you spell your name? I said, Zettl. So he looked through the catalog and said, good, we don't have a Z. This is great. So this is how the handbook started. 1961, believe it or not. All hand-drawn and all this. So I explained what the tools are and how to use them. And then I figured, well, when I started teaching, I thought, but there's a big discrepancy between how to use the tools and directing, for example, or producing. What's in between? You got to know what to do with them. What are the aesthetics of it? You know? And so I filled in through the art, because I saw people, they had no idea how to frame a shot, how to edit and all this, and they just didn't know. And I didn't blame them. I said, well, who taught you? Well, some came out of film, so they have some idea, but film and television were quite different, and I realized that. So I started writing an outline, which later on became Sight, Sound, Motion. So I approached it from different sides, and then I did videos, you know, and stuff to demonstrate how to do it and how not to do it. And then I also wrote some articles on different aspects. So I approached it from different points of view. And then in the 60s, 70s, you know, late 60s, early 70s, we were all artists. It was all video art, and we wiggled the camera and thought it was great. You know, we were out of focus and said, bravo. So all that stuff, you know. But we left that one behind. So now we keep the camera steady again, except for some people who wiggle it again. Well, the approach to media aesthetics is like any other field. It's different. In other words, it's varied. It's not one point of view. But basically there are two camps. One camp is analysis. They use visual criteria and media aesthetic criteria to analyze, pretty much like semiotics, not quite as rigid, but they analyze stuff. They look at a shot and they count how long a shot is, and they do counting, and then they analyze what it is and how it looks and why there are so many close-ups. There are more close-ups than long shots and medium shots and all that. And then, so most of the tradition of approaching aesthetics or any criticism in video comes from literary criticism. You know, it's analyzing what is there. And from the very beginning, I came from a production point of view, not from an analytical point of view. And I thought, well, anybody can analyze it. You know, I can say there's not enough headroom. So what? You know, it's done. The damage is done. So my approach is quite different. My approach is, what are the tools you really work with? A camera, lights, and all this. But what are the aesthetic tools? And then I analyze the aesthetic tools. And the aesthetic tools, the paint I work with actually is really light, two-dimensional space, three-dimensional space, time, and motion, and sound. And I didn't invent that, you know. I mean, painters did that. Kandinsky did that by saying, well, what do I work with? He said, I work with lines, points, color, and texture. And then he built his own little houses that way, and painted his own little paintings, and created his own world. And that's what I did. I said, well, what do we work with? So I looked at light, and I discovered that shadows are more important than light. And I looked at time and motion, and I thought, since it's a small screen, you got to go along the z-axis more than the x-axis. You know, it's rather simple. And I looked at color, and I discovered, well, in television you can't do what you do in painting. The painting in still photography doesn't move. But television moves all the time. Camera moves, the camera moves, people move. So there's a different thing about color. So you need low energy colors in the background, high energy colors in the foreground, you got it made. You know. And I went through systematically. And that now can be applied in a variety of ways, whether you do a web page or whether you do a television screen or a big screen movie. It changes somewhat, but principles are similar. So that's my approach. Now, Bob Tiemens, for example, he's in between. He was one of the first who grabbed sight, sound, motion. That's how we got to know each other, you know. But his approach is more of a physiological one. He comes from how we see, what the eye does. I don't care. You know, I just want to know, what do we do with what we see and how do we make it work for the camera? But he goes into physiology and goes from there. And then sort of drifts into it, but he's more an analytical person. Paul Masaris too, he's a very creative but an analytical person. He says, here is an ad, and he deals quite a bit with still images more than with moving images. And he said, here's an ad, what is it that persuades us? So, but we all talk about the same, you know, about the same thing basically, and we use similar language. Where Lester fits in, Paul Lester, I don't know. He's more, I think he's more sort of an analytical guy. He's more in the Masaris camp, but he's much more global. He goes all over the place and says, now here's an image, and he also includes text and persuasion psychology and all that. So I don't really know where he fits, but which is not bad, you know. You can't put him in a box, which is okay. I don't know whether I have any critics. I don't think they take me seriously enough to be critics of my work. I have people who are critical of me. That's a different thing, you know. And the people who are really critical of me are mostly people who don't understand visual arts. And there's nothing wrong with it, but they don't know what we are talking about. I mean, they're coming from literary criticism, and they're coming from ideological criticism, and they say, well, where is your content, you know? Where is your ideology? Where is your social conscience in all that? And I said, well, you put it in later. I leave it out because I'm talking about elements, you see, and they have a hard time dealing with this because they have been brought up to put everything in a either ideological context or in a literary context or economical context or whatever. So the Marxists have a hard time with me because I said, I don't care what you do, you know, light is light, but they don't like that. So that doesn't mean I'm irresponsible. As a matter of fact, I preach responsibility all the time, you know, and one of my students said, Dr. Zettl, you sound like a preacher. And I said, that's great. You know, so these are really people who are critical of my work, mainly because they are not quite sure what I do. But the people who understand what I'm doing are critical in certain respects, just in more technical aspects. But they are not really critics. Well, I went to television production before I had all that theory. See, I mean, I was an undergraduate at that time, and my thing was basically theater and speech criticism. So the critical approaches were psychology, basically, and I had a big dose of philosophy, which I did on my own. So it was neither a minor nor a recognized thing, but that stuck with me more than anything else. So that turned out to be the more important thing I studied. And it still sort of hangs on. But the critical stuff, I just had to do whatever discipline I took. You know, like at University of California, my mentor, so to speak, was a sociologist. So I had the big doses of sociology there, and they had communication theory, Tannenbaum, all these people, you know. But they were sort of very old-fashioned, and I didn't like what they were doing in a way, but it was, the one I admired very much was Leo Lowenthal was one of them. And Leo Lowenthal came out of the Frankfurt School with Adorno and all these people. And he was a media critic from way back, you know, and not necessarily a negative one. Everybody else was very negative about the media, that they destroy the culture and all this stuff. So I wasn't in that camp because I was producing all that destructive stuff. So, but there was Leo Lowenthal. He was on my dissertation committee, on my oral and my PhD, and he was the guru, you know. And when I approached him whether he would like to be on my committee, he said, "My dear Mr. Zettl," he said, "I'm now in pre-Socratic philosophy. He said, I'm not doing media anymore." So I said, "Well, couldn't you please, you know, sit in?" He said, "Well, okay." So I told him what I was doing. He was interested in it. So he came and he was marvelous. You know, he turned out to be very sharp and very, very precise, but also very good. He understood what I was doing, whereas some of the committee members didn't know what I was doing. But I really, you know, I didn't have a single discipline to do that. I developed my own in a way. I had very good classes and very good teachers, but I didn't follow a single thread, so to speak. So I just did my own. A few projects I have in mind, which are similar to your projects, you know, and then I did that CD-ROM, the production CD-ROM, the Zettl's Video Lab. It was called Video Producer, which was all wrong. It was the publisher's idea. I said, there's very little about production there. It's just how to light and how to turn on and off lights and how to zoom in and out. But they called it Video Producer. So finally a new president came in and now it's called Zettl Video Lab. With the Video Lab, it makes more sense. It's a laboratory, you know. So I want to do a CD-ROM for Sight Sound Motion. Because the one problem in Sight Sound Motion is that it doesn't move. A book doesn't move. A book is a marvelous device, you know. Much better than a laptop. You can take it along, you don't need any power, you can do it, you can look at it in a linear way, you can be nonlinear, you can do a random access, anything. It has pictures in it, has text in it, you know. The only problem is it doesn't move. And so if, for example, if I want to explain a jump cut, I have two little pictures there that both, where the background moves just a little or they move a little. Well, anyone who can see that this is a jump cut doesn't need me. But the people who don't know what a jump cut is have no idea what those two little pictures mean. They almost look the same. So that's where a CD-ROM would come in, with lots of really interactivity, not just clicking on a certain thing to have a choice, but really making it interactive so that my action, the user's action, modifies the answer. That's what interactivity is all about. So that's one thing. The other thing is to develop a little bit more the whole idea about what synthetic imagery is all about. I have most of my life dealt with analytical imagery. That means the lens looking at things and ripping out certain aspects of reality and then putting it on a recording device. But now we have a whole new medium that, like a painter, you can paint things that don't exist, pixel by pixel. So what I haven't really, and the thing we do now is try to be as realistic with that stuff as possible, or make boxes. And I want to find out how does it influence the whole visual communication field. So that's the other thing. And of course the 16:9 ratio is concerning me tremendously because it really will probably lose the intimacy of the picture we have now. Like, try to do a good close-up on the 16:9. So it'll become a landscape medium rather than an Inkscape medium. That's what I'd like to find out.